Welcome once again to the Talking Archive. My name is Josh Jacobs, and it's an honor to be speaking with radio personality, author, actor, educator, and Emmy-nominated producer and writer, and he's the winner of many awards, Gary Theroux. Thanks for coming on.
Well, I appreciate being able to talk to you.
Well, tell us about your life growing up and how you got into radio at age 11.
Well, that's kind of an interesting story, perhaps. The way that actually happened was my mom was involved in a number of charities, and one of them was for a place in Millbank, New York, called the Millbank Home, which is an orphanage, actually. And they decided to do some radio spots to promote it and attract more people to donate to it. And I got recruited. So that was the very first time I was on the radio.
Wow.
Was as a spokesman for the Millbank Home. And I was so fascinated by the whole thing, I decided to stick with it.
And with that, did you build your own radio studio in your house and play records and kind of build up a resume and some reels? And how did that work out?
Well, I first, using my own home tape recorder and a home turntable, I started sort of playing DJ and recording those. And one of those tapes found its way to WJBC in Bloomington, Illinois, where my family had moved. And they invited me to come in one day as a guest disc jockey. And they seemed to enjoy what I was doing. And that's how that all started.
What was the format of that station?
It was a variety of things. Most radio stations today have one format that they follow 24/7. But back at that point, which is about 1965, radio stations had more eclectic formats, and they would have a talk show for several hours, and then they'd play music, and they'd do something entirely after that different.
Wow! And what did you get to do as far as the variety was concerned?
Well, I got to play primarily the current hits that the radio station was playing, but it also gave me a chance to explore their oldies library and discover all these records that I was too young to have known about first time around. And I discovered that there were all of these great tracks that I had no idea ever existed. And that inspired me to dig deeper and deeper into pop music history.
Now, after Illinois, you got to go to several other radio stations. What radio stations did you go to before you hit the big time in Los Angeles at 1150 KIIS?
Well, let's see. There was a country station in Normal, Illinois. Prior to my joining that radio station, I appeared on the campus radio station at Illinois State University, and I was taking courses in radio programming and production. And what I found was that all the classes I was taking to learn about radio actually interrupted my education, because I learned a lot more by working at the campus radio station and inventing different shows in different formats and basically exploring the possibilities for radio on my own.
Who are some of the radio personalities you looked up to growing up?
Well, there were quite a few, but I would say that the one in particular who affected my style the most, unfortunately, was WLS star Larry Lujak. Larry had a sort of a laconic approach to broadcasting, and I picked up on that. And it took me years to work the Lujak out of my style. Because that particular style that he was employing is something that he was a master of. But when other people tried to emulate it, it didn't work. And I found out that what really works best, and I really kind of knew that from the beginning, is to simply be yourself and act like people are out driving in their cars, and you want to be that invisible friend in the passenger seat who has interesting things to say, is friendly, and has great music to play. That's what works.
Oh, definitely. That was some of the best advice I ever got myself. I asked game show legend Jack Nars that question at the Game Show Cars Convention about 20 years ago, because he said, the young guys, they don't want to learn from us old pros when it comes to game shows. And I said, Jack, I'm one of those young guys who does. What's your advice about hosting a game show? He gave me two very simple things. Be yourself. Don't try to be anybody else. It's okay to be inspired and influenced, but be yourself. And second of all, have a good time, because if you're not having a good time, the contestants aren't going to have a good time.
Well, that's very good advice. And there was a time, say back in the 1940s, where announcers on radio would talk at you, and that was kind of frustrating. Eventually, a guy came along named Arthur Godfrey who changed all that by deciding instead to have a one-on-one conversation, one-sided conversation with the listener. And that made him far more appealing to listeners, and other DJs started taking on that style rather than sounding ponderous and pretentious.
Yeah, exactly. And when you worked at the different radio stations, how often did you get to meet artists coming into the station, or since it was smaller stations, did they usually kind of skip the small market?
Well, it depended on the artist. I remember one time, this is probably 1972, I was working at the country radio station in Norwalk, which is not in Norwalk, but in Normal, Illinois. Mm-hmm. Very small station. And a station wagon drove up, and a couple got out with a little girl. And they walked in, and they said, our daughter sings, and would you interview her? And gave me her name, and of course it didn't mean anything to me. But I said, okay. So I took her into a production room and interviewed her, and I was quite impressed with her, although I felt that her parents were really pushing her, and she was rather tired of the promotional efforts that her parents were kind of inflicting on her. That was Tanya Tucker.
Wow.
And she had just signed with Columbia and had just put out her first Columbia single, which eventually went to #1 country.
Yeah, and she's just made a comeback in the last couple of years as well.
Yeah, I met her again in Los Angeles in 1978. And she's really been through the ringer over the years, but is truly a talent.
She definitely is. And speaking of talent, you got to be a talent at 1150 KIIS, which eventually became KISS. What were your responsibilities as operations director there?
Well, KISS was operating, first of all, I should mention that KISS was operating out of the Playboy building on Sunset. And that was kind of interesting because if you walked into the KISS offices, which were on the first floor, the first thing you saw were a sofa that looked like two luscious red lips. And among the people who would be constantly coming through there would be these absolutely beautiful girls. And the reason was they'd then get in the elevator and go up to the 9th floor. That's where Playboy had their photo studio. And all the time I was working there, I was always saying, hey, could I at least come in and, like hold the lights or something? But I never got invited to any of those. But at KISS, it was a top 40 radio station. And we had some really fine personalities there. And as operations director, what you really spend most of your time doing is putting out fires. People come and say, oh, I have a problem with this or a problem with that. But one never knows what's going to happen. One time, the receptionist at the front desk called me. She said, there were a bunch of people picketing outside the radio station. And I said, what? So I go out there, and there are all these weird-looking guys holding signs that KISS is unfair. And I decided to invite them inside and talk to them. And they explained that they had a rock group, and we weren't playing their record. But we should, because their name was Kiss.
Oh. So you got to meet, did you meet the band members themselves or just the fans?
Oh, yeah. Gene Simmons and all the other ones were there.
Wow.
And Gene explained that he had tried for a long time to try to break through into the record business with no success. And he finally was told, well, you need to have a gimmick. And he thought, well, maybe what we really need is to have a whole bunch of gimmicks. And maybe that will help us achieve notoriety and some success. And the problem is with most groups, if they adopt a gimmick, the gimmick wears its welcome out rather quickly. But Kiss came up with a whole bunch of them, and by the time some of their gimmicks started wearing off, the group was already well established.
Yeah. I became a super group in the 1970s. I remember being in elementary school back in the late 70s. I had a lot of classmates drawing the Kiss logo. It was really cool. I was like, man, I wish I could do that. I just was not able to perfect it until later on.
What Gene said was that we're not really that great, but maybe with a lot of hype, we can actually score some hits. And they were lucky enough to sign with Casablanca Records, which was run by Neil Bogart, who had previously been the head of Buddha Records, and which is known for a whole string of essentially one-shot novelty acts. You know, the 1910 Fruit Gun Company and the Lemon Pipers and stuff like that. And he believed that in a record company's responsibility is to spend almost all of its promotional budget hyping a new act. And if you get enough hype out there, you can create hits for almost anyone. And he was somewhat accurate in that because he did make stars out of Kiss and Donna Summer and a few other acts, but not a whole lot on Casablanca. Of course, he made the Village People huge stars. But when I talked to, I forget his name now, but he was the cowboy in the Village People, I said, you realize you're set up for a short career. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, Diana Ross can go out and put on a concert somewhere and change costumes 15 times. You guys can't. You're locked into one image. And he goes, I never thought about that. And it was only a few months after that the Village People turned up in a movie called Can't Stop the Music, which not only could stop the music, it did. And the Village People's career as hitmakers evaporated shortly after that.
Well, they only had really 3 top 40 hits I can think of on the top of my head: YMCA, In the Navy, and Macho Man. That's pretty much it.
Right. And then they put out a single called Ready for the 80s, which you don't remember because hardly anybody played it.
And by the time the 80s rolled around, why play it?
Well, they decided to move from Casablanca since the label had sort of soured on them. They moved to RCA, which is the label you go to if you want to see your career completely die. And they decided to come back as a punk act in the early 80s, and that was a total flop. So the Village People, or what's left of them, now tour county fairs and stuff, playing their Casablanca-era hits.
Wow, I never even knew about them trying the punk rock style. I mean, Blondie started off as a punk rocker, and she incorporated disco into her music, but that was before she was a hit maker, and so the disco with punk combination was what made her a big star.
Well, the punk scene was a big deal in New York, Los Angeles, and in, say, London, and nowhere else. See if you can think up the names of any punk acts that actually made it.
The Ramones.
There's really very few, and of them, Blondie is the only one that was truly successful.
That's true, because the Ramones, they get played on alternative stations today, kind of as a cult following, if you will, but they never really had any top 40 hits. I think the Sex Pistols, again, legendary in the punk scene, but never had any hits. Heck, Sid Vicious didn't even appear on any of their albums, yet he's the bassist who's best remembered rather than the bassist who was actually on their records.
Right.
And at Kiss, you also had a lot of great DJs, from Charlie Tuna to T. Michael Jordan. Who are some of the others? Humble Harv was on there, I think. What are your memories of the different DJs? Anybody stand out to you when you were there?
Well, you pretty much mentioned them.
Oh, okay. And you also had the successful KISS broadcasting workshop. What did the classes focus on, and who are some of the well-known alumni that graduated from there?
Well, that's kind of an interesting story. There was a guy named Bill Anderson, not the country singer, who had worked at the Columbia School of Broadcasting, and he worked with a guy named Philip Trout, who was doing sort of regional sales for them. And he discovered that Philip Trout was particularly successful at rounding up students. So he looked up the guy, and they collaborated as a team, left the Columbia School of Broadcasting, and decided to go to KISS to start the KISS Broadcasting Workshop. And to do that, the first person they hired was Art Hannes, who was the announcer on the Ed Sullivan Show. And during World War II, he was one of Edward R. Murrow's chief correspondents on the European theater.
Wow.
And Ed had a great voice, and Art had an unbelievably deep voice. In fact, he told me that one time at CBS, he was in an elevator with a bunch of other deep-voiced announcers, and they were competing as to who could hit the lowest note. And Art finally decided to lie down on the floor of the elevator and say, "I can get lower than anybody." But again, Art was the first person hired, and I came in and was actually the second person. And what Art and I discovered was that these guys, the two founders of the KISS Broadcasting Workshop, had a basic idea for their production, but they hadn't worked out any kind of curriculum. So Art and I sat down and actually created all the classes, and we based it on what we wished people had told us when we got into broadcasting. And it was really wonderful working with Art, and I really treasure that time. But we had a succession of DJs and other people from area radio stations come in to teach different classes, and that was kind of fun. We also were able to call up people that we knew around Los Angeles, like George Fenneman, who was Groucho Marx's announcer.
Oh, yeah.
Came in as a guest speaker one time, and he was terrific.
That's great.
So we did the KISS Broadcasting Workshop for a couple of years, and then I got a call from Bill Drake, who was telling me that they wanted to put together a new version of the history of rock and roll, which is something that had been put together at KHJ in Los Angeles in 1968 and 69, and debuted over KHJ Radio in Los Angeles in 1969.
Wow.
And it caused quite a sensation in the industry and became syndicated around. And in 1970, WLS in Chicago decided to broadcast the history of rock and roll. And they had been doing a short-form feature which dealt with rock history called Retro Rock, hosted by Frank Kingston Smith. And I was fascinated by those. And so when they did this history of rock and roll thing, wow, I ran down to Radio Shack and bought up a whole slew of tape reels so I could air check this whole thing. And I almost did it, too. However, it being 48 hours long, I fell asleep partway through.
Oh.
But I did get a lot of it. But I had no idea in 1970, when I was still a student, that in 1976, or 77 rather, Bill Drake would call me up and say, "Well, I heard that you are writing a book on rock history, and you have quite some interesting radio credentials, and you've interviewed a lot of recording artists. Would you be willing to come in and create some new hours to update the KHJ version. And I said, sure.
This is the Talking Archive. I'm Josh Jacobs. We're talking with Gary Theroux, radio personality and musicologist. And next time, Gary discusses more about updating the history of rock and roll with Bill Drake.